podcast. She said, she was saying how she says mandatory, and I realised, no, where's the A? Mandatory. M-A-N-D-T-R-Y? No, mandatory.
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 It's mandatory, man.
Where's the A gone? And the O, mandatory. That I literally pronounce every single letter. Mandatory.
Yeah,
you're mandatory.
Mandatory.
Yeah, what? So M-A-N-D-T-R-E. Yeah, exactly. There's a bloke up a hedge. Mandatory.
Everyone I've asked has said mandatory.
Yes, Will. Well, I'm not everybody, am I? Hence why I started a sodding podcast. Yeah, and on that note, let's start. Hello, and welcome to Something Near the Centre, a podcast about politics, economics, and current events. I'm James.
And I'm Will.
And today, we're going to be having a chat.
Can we please stop using that line?
No, Will, that's our slogan.
Sorry.
Well, it's here now, and it's here to stay.
Like COVID-19.
Witty banter. Speaking of, is that where we're going to start?
What, COVID?
Just a little quick update.
Yeah, basically, nothing's changed. Only
surprise.
We can now go to shops.
Yeah, as of today or yesterday?
Today. We can now have a bubble.
Well, yes, we'll expand on that. So you can go to shops now for non-essential items. Places like Primark are opening. People were queuing out from the early hours in the morning just to get, a T-shirt for £1. If you want it, fair enough. Your life, you live it. And
take proper precautions.
Yeah, obviously 2 meters as much as you can. Wear a face mask if you can. Face masks are now compulsory on public transport, or at least a face covering. So whether that's a balaclava or a scarf. And then this bubble idea is if you live alone, you can basically go and join up with another family or a partner, and so you could expand your bubble. So it's just about still limiting contact, but it's called a support bubble. So as you'd expect, someone living alone, or I think it's a single parent, isn't it? Single parents can do it again. So you might need to go and see grandparents.
You could do that anyway. Yeah, you could go see like your dad. Like if your parents are separated.
Oh yeah, no. So this is single parents can now join up with another family, close family friends, or their parents, to help with childcare and things like that. But yeah, so Will, you have big news this week, don't you?
I went to Mackey's. Woo!
I've been there 4 times now since reopening.
I was directing traffic.
Yeah, well, it was all right actually. That's why I've been there. I work there, for those of you who don't know. So I was directing traffic all day yesterday, which was glorious. Stood outside in the sunshine, watching the cars go by.
I had a race in the car park.
With whom?
A Fiat 500 that was like 3 cars in front of me.
How did you race them?
The Mackey's I went to, there's 2 lanes.
Oh, yeah, there is at mine.
So I went an inside lane. I got directed into the inside lane. They were on the outside lane. Beat them. And that's what kept me occupied for 40 minutes.
Anyway, podcasting. That's the little COVID update.
It's going to be a very international episode today.
It is. Well, it's a bit of a special in that sense, simply because not a great deal's going on. So we're going to
Nothing is happening that is exciting or new.
Apart from white supremacists fighting police in Britain.
Yeah, but nothing that we haven't already covered.
So another update is the protests are going on, but this time the All Lives Matter white middle-aged man brigade came down in their football T-shirts and started protesting in London about why people shouldn't deface the statues. The only issue with that, well, one of many actually, was that the Black Lives Matter protest they were trying to protect the statues from
happened the other day.
Yeah, it didn't turn up, mate. There was going to be another one, and they cancelled because they didn't want to fight off with, to have to deal with these guys. And so these guys got bored. They got very drunk, drinking cheap lager, and started fighting the police. Oh, and a horrendous story of a guy who has since turned himself into the police, and he's been charged with public indecency, who urinated on a police officer's memorial. It was the police officer who died during the Westminster Bridge terrorist attack. Horrendous behaviour, but I don't think I have to tell you that. So yeah, they started fighting the police, and there was numerous arrests, and also now headline in the Sunday Telegraph: 10 years in jail for protesters who desecrate war memorials. So that's good news, at least. That's war memorials as well, not statues, which is the more important thing to protect, because that's protecting the memory of people who fought for Britain rather than people who are controversial and famous British figures. But that's literally it. That's our quick roundup. I've just remembered I've forgotten to close my window. And so to all you lovely podcast listeners out there, you can hear the birds tweeting. I'm not going to close my window unless somebody fires up a lawnmower simply because I don't want to turn my bedroom, which is south-facing, into a
sauna.
So moving on, Will, I think we'll start with you. Any little updates for the US?
So the US, nothing new really has happened. Trump's still campaigning on law and order, and now threatened to take over the protests that happen in Seattle. So they've literally created a block where it's only protesters are allowed, and they've stayed in there for like 2 weeks now, taken up about 6 blocks, and they haven't moved since. And Trump says unless the mayor and the governor takes action, he'll send in the military. And then there's also a campaign in Minneapolis, where the George Floyd killing happened, to what Donald calls defunding the police. However, it's merely a total restructure of the Minneapolis Police Department. It kind of plays into Trump's hands, though, of they're getting rid of the police. The Democrats can't be trusted, so it's an interesting campaign point. Boom.
Yeah, so that they are your updates that we'd usually spend about 40 minutes on. And whilst we have been recording for about 40 minutes, we've mostly been chatting for that. But now, because there hasn't been much to cover, we're moving on to wider world issues. And these aren't like this week's world issues. These are sort of things that are long-standing, but we'll cover in this special episode whilst we've got the time. So, Will, you can start off. I think we'll finish on the biggest topic as like a grand finale.
Should we go through what we're talking about today? Brazil and their reaction to coronavirus. We're going to talk about statues and their place in history and how we should look at history now. And we're going to round off with Hong Kong 1 year on.
Yeah.
I thought it was a good title for that.
Very good title. Well done, Will. You must have spent, what, half an hour, 3 hours maybe thinking about that?
Yeah, it took me so long to think of that.
Well done.
But sometimes the simplest titles are the best.
Like something near the centre.
Mate, that took us about 5 weeks to come up with.
Well, I came up with it quite quickly when I decided we needed a new title.
After bridging the gap.
But, that's not news. Brazil.
So, yeah. Brazil has recorded the second highest number of cases in 867,000 cases and has had over 43,000 deaths of coronavirus. And much criticism has been landed on the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, for his lack of reaction to this pandemic. So, like the US, it's a federalist system, so you got governors and mayors of different states. However, it needs a whole coordinated communication response with that, which there was at the beginning until April the 16th. The Brazilian health minister was having daily calls with governors and coordinate a response until he was sacked on April 16th. Since then, there has been no such discussions on coronavirus and how they're going to tackle it as a country. And Bolsonaro has frequently also been downplaying the virus, trying to preserve his economy and the running of the country. However, it's had what some economists believe as... Am I saying that right? Economists? Or economists?
I say economists. Some people say economists, but nobody says economists.
Sorry.
Economists.
Economist. Economic.
No, economists.
Economists.
Yeah.
Economists. Economists.
Or economists.
Economists. Many people, including several economists, have said it will significantly impact the economy and economic growth in the future will be drastically slowed down. Since Bolsonaro has relaxed many regulations and has opened up the economy to the free market, it's seen several investments. However, since February, when the first recorded case of coronavirus in Brazil it has seen a withdrawal of £24 billion since February, and debt in the country has continued to rise, and it's widely seen as further impacting because the 2010s were seen as a missed decade for Brazil in terms of taking that economic growth forward. Also, there hasn't been nationwide quarantine in Brazil as well. He's launched 2 legal cases when governors tried to put in place statewide lockdowns. He showed up at quarantine protests, and also they have a massive problem with testing as well, so 50,000 tests. So James, what's your reaction?
I think it's just another case of a leader who's decided to ignore facts and go with opinions and try and prey on people's hearts and hatreds rather than showing them evidence and science, etc., etc. And I also think it's already a very pig-headed approach. And I also fear for the Brazilian economy, but more in the sense that they're an emerging country, and they also are home to the majority of the Amazon rainforest. Now, for those of you who are a little bit uptight with the environment like I am, and who value it, much more than the Brazilian president does, know that this is probably, a terrible thing to happen if Brazil's economy is tanking after a time when it was trying to build it up would fail. They'll just go with the proven method of what sort of works, which is just selling off huge amounts of the rainforest to the private sector for them to then reap all the rewards that ecosystems may provide, planting palm oil or slash and burn tactics of land clearance for cattle, etc., etc. And so, the COVID-19, whilst it is terrible, hopefully within a decade can look back on it and say, all in the past, we've built our economies back up, etc., etc. Within the climate crisis is just going to follow us around forever.
So what you're saying is, if Bolsonaro desperately wants economic growth to return after COVID is finished, he's going to damage the Amazon, which is more environmentally costly, to try and recover growth.
Yes, exactly. And I think so. Whilst all economies need to recover as fast as possible for the good of the population, I just think with Brazil, if any country needed to protect its economy for the good of the globe, it's probably them.
Well, he's famously short-tempered as well. So I don't know if you've seen, so they put all their cabinet conferences online. So he was asking questions, and it just ended up in him ranting about why the media and prosecutors were trying to take to trial his two sons, and he went full on profanity, etc. And you just go, oh wow, he's described as the Trump of the Latin Americas, and it's really easy to see. I find him such a strange and interesting character, but one that should never be a head of state for a country.
Yes, you're right. I also think Brazil struggles with corruption and crime and poverty. Having a Trump there is even worse. You need somebody who's actually got the nation's best interests at heart rather than someone like that who's just...
I don't know if you noticed, people did a memorial on Copacabana Beach of like mini graves, and people went down knocking them over because they see it as a too much fuss over nothing. And they see it as a left-wing sort of conspiracy in a way, and it's very much split that whole country down the middle, as it's kind of seen as a left-right issue, which is insane. One moment where you should come together for the good of public health, and it's now become a major political dividing point in that country.
Yeah, I think it's a similar, again, talking about Donald Trump, it's those sort of tactics which is just divide and conquer, where you split the population down the middle, and as long as you've got more than 50%, that you're good to go, and you don't even bother trying to repair any of the issues. And regardless of, like I was saying, whether you follow the facts or whether you follow your heart, it's a way that works. Use it as a campaigning point. And when you've got somebody that pig-headed who just won't be pragmatic about any situation and sort of wants to just continue to push an agenda regardless of the situation, you see with this, I'll just use it as even a point to campaign rather than a point to sort of stop and say, right, this is an issue, it's bigger than politics, let's put the brakes on, and it's just not going to happen. That's the way the world politics is going. It's very divisive. It's getting to start be more populist and slightly more nationalist, and let's hope that after this crisis the world kind of resets a bit and we kind of find a more pragmatic and open and considerate way of... But I don't think it's going to happen, especially not if...
optimistic view of the world.
Well, yeah, especially if Trump wins a second election, it won't happen. And I think, although in Britain, Keir Starmer should be helpful for us, simply because he's not extreme in his politics, and so he'll be more welcoming instead of being hate the Tories, hate the Tories, hate the Tories. It's more like we get it, but try this. And so hopefully that'll happen in the globe. We don't think you're horrible for voting for them, but why don't you try voting for us, and it might change things, that kind of thing. And I think we need to see that more. But yeah, as with the leaders who are like that, Boris, Trump and Bolsonaro, it's weird. The worst three countries all practice that kind of politics.
That is Brazil. Shall we talk about statues and history?
Yeah, so this is a slightly more British-centric topic, but it obviously applies
an American,
to... it applies to the wider world as well. I guess it is topical, but it's also just a point of discussion anyway.
So the one that really struck me, so Obviously, we've seen the defacing of Churchill and the bringing down statue of Edward Colston, those we've seen last week. There's also been talks about the Scout Leader statue being taken down. Christopher Columbus in America, he's been taken down.
Christopher Columbus was beheaded
Yeah, no,
in
he was
America.
beheaded.
The statue was beheaded in America of Christopher Columbus.
In Virginia, they are vowing to take down the statue of General Lee, who was the leader of the Confederates in the American Civil War. And then I've seen one of the Harold Wilson statue in Huddersfield, his hometown. There's been calls to take that down. And they say for Harold Wilson, it was his role in supporting the Nigerian government in the Biafran Civil War, which was a horrific civil war that lasted for about 7 years, and it led to the starvation of many Biafran children, and many war crimes were committed on both sides, and it was a horrific bloody civil war. What I would say for Harold Wilson was the Nigerian government had only recently been given its independence in 1960, and it was a British-backed government all the way through. So he couldn't really withdraw his support there, or else he's damaging the political integrity of the Commonwealth. And it had been very damaging for him on the world stage. And you've got to remember, Britain at this time was very weak on the world stage. So you had the withdrawal from East of Suez. There was also criticism of him on the Vietnam War as well. But this one really did damage him in a sort of way, because it's not like everyone just went along with this opinion. He faced mass criticism because it wasn't only shown in the news, it was shown in articles of Time magazine. I suggest you go have a look at the front covers of them, of Biafran children extremely malnourished and are just skin and bone. It really is harrowing to look at. And it did cost him, it was one of the factors that cost him the 1970 election. We should have these discussions about the ugly points in history. So the Edward Colsons, the Harold Wilsons, General Lees.
Well, the thing is, I just want to interrupt there. Harold Wilson is completely different to Edward Colston and General Lee. He's this kind of person who, on the whole, has done so much good for Britain.
Yeah, so I've got him up here. So he established the Open University, decriminalised homosexuality, made abortions available, as well as the birth control pill for everyone, and abolished the death penalty.
Sounds good to me.
We're just remembering him for one thing, which we should do, because we should draw criticism of him, and like we do it in history level, and there is wide criticism of Harold Wilson for this. It's not like everyone is completely oblivious to this. He has faced widespread criticism back then as well, from even within his own party.
I'm just not sure with this wider discussion. A person can make a few decisions that they may later on regret, but it shouldn't harm their whole legacy. A good way I heard it put is with say General Lee, who was a Confederate leader, right? A statue of him symbolizes everything that America should oppose. He was a Confederate leader who wanted to keep slavery and didn't want the United States to be the United States and didn't want, all the reforms that went on afterwards.
He's seen as in the South as a person that can champion their cause.
The way I saw it was with the statues is if somebody's being placed on a pedestal because their actions are being celebrated directly oppose the common wisdom and the common beliefs and what's good for the country and good for the community and good for the culture as a whole, then it can be taken down. But if somebody who's done net good, so Harold Wilson or Winston Churchill, Gandhi, etc., whilst they may have some low points in their beliefs or in their values or even in their actions, I think if what they're being celebrated for isn't those issues, but it's more, a wider good, so Winston Churchill and his defeat of Nazi Germany, Harold Wilson and all his wonderful social reforms, or Gandhi for, getting independence for India from British colonial rule, that's what's being celebrated and not...
We can't just take down the people whose views now are no longer acceptable. So, we need to have a discussion about people like Nelson Mandela as well, who his cause for the banning of apartheid in South Africa, we of course support and we laud him for, but we've also got to remember he has used terrorist methods in the past, and we've got to have a wider scope of history and go, look, you did do this, but you also did that. If we're holding some people in some lights there, we need to bring all our historical figures to that same sort of light. Similar to the suffragette movement as well. Yes, obviously we support women's suffrage, but they did use terror methods as well to get their point of view across. I hate to say something, I did agree with Boris Johnson on his Winston Churchill comments.
It's got a lot of backing from people who wouldn't normally back Boris.
Well, I do back him. It's one of the only times I ever have, and probably ever will. But we can't suddenly start to rewrite history. We've got to be very frank and open our eyes up to more that history is brutal, history is
And you
ugly,
and you
history
can't
is
censor it.
no. That's the best way for it though. You could never censor history. So I get why they want to talk about Winston Churchill's views being out of touch with now and very borderline racist, but you've got to understand what he's done then. And I encourage them for that, but you can't just say, oh, we've got to take down his statue because of that one thing.
People need to learn that people do have imperfections, simply because, in the case of, say, Winston Churchill, you get lots of people thinking he is completely perfect and faultless, and any single criticism of him warrants torrents of abuse, and that's not right. So I think it's just all about wider education.
Educate yourself on race. We should also educate ourselves on history more and have a wider look at history in all parts of the world, for ugly and good, and we'll be better for it.
I think with the statues, it's not offense that we should deny taking all of them down because you can't deny history, but I just think that you can't just have a blanket approach to anybody who's ever caused, some sort of issue or done anything that's wrong should instantly be platformed or disregarded as somebody who's otherwise done good. But then again, I also think that this really isn't the biggest issue that's facing us currently, but seeing as it's the topic of discussion, I don't particularly disagree with everybody who wants to get rid of some statues, because whilst yes, you can't ignore history, there are also other figures of history who could be celebrated and are more worthy of a celebration. You find your way to not write people out of history, but also to celebrate the right people. And again, it's about where you draw the line, and that's more the issue with this debate. But yeah, I'll stop waffling and we can move on. Yeah, so now moving on to the headline subject almost of this podcast.
If this was not COVID time or protests and riots going on, this would be the biggest news story.
Rightly so.
Astonished how it hasn't got more media coverage because it's so important.
Exactly, and
it will affect the economy here, economy in America, international relations going forward,
and also people's liberties and freedoms being taken away from them. In a world where we want to build more and more democracy and freedom for individuals, it's about to be taken away for 7.5 million people. On that note, we're going to be talking about Hong Kong. And so to start us off, I get to talk about the British Empire and some history. The 1800s, 1840s, 1997.
Take us away.
So, Britain was expanding its empire and its world trade, and this was the beginning of globalization. We discovered something from China, and China was the only country to produce it during the Qing dynasty. And Brits become rather fond of it, and we still love it today. And that is, of course, tea. Brilliant. Love a cup of tea, don't we? So it all started back then. And so to buy tea from China, the emperor at the time demanded we pay for it in silver. And Britain was like, mate, I'm loving this tea. Have all the silver you like. Keep giving it to me. Then there was an issue. Britain's treasury almost ran out of silver and there was a national crisis. How do we solve the national crisis? Well, by doing something completely unethical and slightly evil. So the British Empire, basically, its whole thesis was around that. We started to export a highly addictive and damaging drug to China called opium, which was banned and illegal in China, but we still sold it anyway to the population. And the population would pay us in, you'll guess, silver. So now we were selling drugs to the Chinese, who were giving us silver, who then we were going to pay back to the Chinese to give us tea, which would feed our addiction to the drug caffeine. What happened was China found out about Britain selling opium illegally to half its country, banned us from trading, and then there was a war on many of them, the Opium Wars, all throughout the 18th century. And finally, they came to a compromise. The settlement basically arranged that Britain could continue trade. Britain won, by the way, surprise, surprise. Came to an agreement, and Britain could continue trading, but there was no opium. And we ended up with a little set of rocky islands called Hong Kong. And from there, it was an extension of the British Empire, and it was a key trading port for the rest of South Asia, basically. And so what was really good about it is because it was a key trading port, it grew wealthy. And because it grew wealthy, it drew in Chinese immigrants. And so you ended up with, by the time Britain handed it back to the Chinese after a 99-year lease deal negotiated in 1898, you ended up with a fusion of Western and British culture with Chinese culture to create Hong Kong. So you had very liberal free market economics with like a Scottish banking system, as it's called, which is where HSBC HSBC was founded. It was the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, which is obviously Britain and Europe's largest bank. And so it's now, as I said, a huge global economic power because of its hugely free trading laws and its access to the Asian markets, basically. 1997, Britain handed over Hong Kong to the Chinese. Hong Kong remained basically mostly independent, apart from it didn't have power over its foreign affairs and national security laws, because obviously
Article 23.
Yes, yeah.
Article 23 of the Basic Law of Hong Kong says it should enact laws on its own against treason, succession, sedition, and subversion, as well as to prohibit ties between Hong Kong bodies and foreign political organisations.
Yeah, so basically that just means that China gets to take care of the national security for Hong Kong just because it is still technically Chinese, even though it's still its own independent body, and so it helps them keep like a succinct foreign policy, etc.
The thing is, Hong Kong hasn't enacted anything.
No, it's not done anything towards it. No. So going back a bit, Britain handed over Hong Kong, because this is the end of the lease agreement, to China, and there's a 50-year period from 1997 to 2047 where Hong Kong is still independent as it slowly integrates back into China, basically, and then in 2047 China takes over and it has control over Hong Kong. So the people of Hong Kong like this independence, and so the deadline of 24/7 isn't something they're really looking forward to. And something they're liking even less is Xi Jinping, who is the president of China and the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, is finding his way to get his hands on Hong Kong and bring it into China before the deadline in 27 years. So, Will, what is he trying to do? How is he doing it? And why is it causing issues?
They want to pass this national security law, which can extradite criminals to China to face several human rights abuses in prison, etc. Human rights abuses and terrible living conditions. So these include crimes of subversion, state power separation, or terrorism. But it's also included, you now have to sing the national anthem, and you can no longer defile the national anthem or anything like that. Protesters as well as deemed as terrorists. So then, but however, it's the problem with this, it's enacting this national security law. It has not had any input from Hong Kong, and it completely overrides the Hong Kong Assembly.
Yeah, so I was just going to talk about where the extradition law actually came from. There was a man and his girlfriend went on holiday from Hong Kong into Taiwan, which is officially part of the Republic of China. And so they went on holiday to Taiwan. Only the boyfriend returned. It later turned out that he'd murdered his girlfriend, and he'd admitted this to the Hong Kong officials. But because it wasn't a crime committed in Hong Kong, he'd have to be tried and punished in Taiwan. However, there's no extradition agreement between Hong Kong and Taiwan. So that's basically where you are taken out of the country you're currently in, and you can go to another one for your crimes that you committed there. And so unless he went to Taiwan under his own steam, unless he went to Taiwan because he wanted to, which he wouldn't, because he'd get put in prison underneath the laws of the Chinese regime, there's nothing they could do about it. So to solve this problem, the government in Hong Kong decided that they would, draw up a bill to allow for extradition, and so this would mean that he could get tried in Taiwan. However, it would also open up extradition to mainland China for the people of Hong Kong, which means that any crime committed in Hong Kong, no matter what it was, and so this would obviously be then later political crimes, because of the oppression of the state, they could be tried under the biased Chinese Communist Party courts and then punished in the prisons there, which obviously a huge infringement on human rights, and it's horrible. I don't even want to talk about it. And so all the people of Hong Kong were like, no, this is one man. We can't let this change the whole freedom of the country.
But
and the criminal system.
It's then seen as like China now taking control over Hong Kong.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why about a year
along
ago
with human rights
from now, yeah, well, exactly. So a year ago from now, this is when this all kicked off.
It kicked off on the 12th of June 2019.
There was huge protests, hundreds of thousands of people just wanting to get this bill stopped. Now, the reason they wanted to stop the bill is despite the fact that Hong Kong is supposedly autonomous over its own government and it's still a democracy. I've actually got some notes on the Hong Kong Constitution, which is really interesting and not boring, despite what you think. And Will, I think you'll like this. So the Hong Kong democratic system is they have a chief executive who isn't chosen by the people. They're chosen by a small committee and then approved by China. So already,
which is like 0.02% of the population.
Yeah, exactly. So already that's China sort of having a grasp over the democratic system. Now, the chief executive is separate to the legislative council, which they have, which is 70 seats, and there's loads of parties. Some are pro-democracy, some are pro-China, and every election in the popular vote, the pro-democracy parties win, and that's every election they've had since 1997 when they got their new freedom from British rule. However, they still have less than half of the seats. Now, obviously this isn't what's expected. Only 40 of the 70 seats are voted for by Hong Kong's population, and the other 30 are given to industry. So the finance industry, the medical industry, and the insurance industry would all have their own seats, so one of the 30 seats. These big corporations work in China and they work in Hong Kong, so it's within their interest to try and appease and be friendly to the Chinese Communist Party, who govern single-party state, obviously. It's like a dictatorship, if you didn't know. Yeah. So they are incentivized to be friendly with China. So these 30 seats, most of them that are given to industry are China backing. And so the reason they didn't want this bill to even go through the Legislative Council was because they knew the Chinese dominated it, despite the democracy they do have, that they didn't like that. So they wanted to stop the bill before it even got into any sort of process of beginning to be voted on. What do you think about that as a system of governance, Will?
We're still trying to get over how you can win the popular vote so significantly every single time and don't have a majority.
Yeah, I know, it's unbelievable. It would work potentially if the Chinese state wasn't so authoritarian and the industry was voting for what they thought was in the best needs of themselves and the people. Yeah. But because they're voting for the best needs of themselves, they're going to, by default, just go, and work with the Communist Party who are in charge. So that's just a bit of context as to why the bill had to be stopped rather than them just getting as, if we don't like a bill here, we just lobby our MPs. They couldn't do that because they knew it would go through.
So we've got several questions that can stem off this. So the first one is, how has COVID had an impact in these protests?
Perfectly well timed for the president in China. He's basically used the coronavirus legislation, which protects the population from the spread of the virus, to ban the protests. And so there are rules that no more than 8 people can gather. And if you're having a protest, you're going to have more than 8 people gathering. And so you can just outlaw the protest, arrest anybody who's protesting for breaking the laws. And so this is the perfect time to get this bill through, simply because you can say, there's nobody there to try and stop it.
I'd also say it's a perfect time for China because it's taken away any international reaction to it. Like before, when the protests were going on last year, we had it's all over the news, people probably talking about it, whereas this year, because we're so focused on coronavirus, it's really sort of detracted any sort of international effort on it, which is a perfect time for Xi Jinping to act so he hasn't faced any real criticism or any media attention here. It has started in America again, but also it's kind of a good point for national unity in China. So you've just had the coronavirus, but it has been such an effective way, COVID has been, to shut down any sort of protests that can go ahead, because they could all just be arrested. But this is how serious the situation is getting now. There's been threats of military action by Xi Jinping in Hong Kong.
Right, so on that note of a terrible communist dictator trying to ruin and get his hands all over a wonderful free market economy and freedom and free people, we're going to take a lovely little break. We'll nominate the biscuit.
I don't know.
So I'm going to nominate the biscuit. It's hot day today. We want something a bit light. Hong Kong's very wealthy. It was tea that brought the Opium Wars about. Rich tea biscuit. That's what we're going for. It's a topical biscuit, Will. So Will's reading an article I've just recommended to him. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about the break. Will, just take your headphones out or something, whatever it is. Just mute me.
I don't have any headphones, so...
Okay, just turn your volume off. I'll carry on talking. Then I'll go and... So, see you in a bit, Will. Get a rich tea biscuit. I'm going to go and get a can of Coke. Too hot today for a hot drink. Maybe a few other little snacks. If you're not wanting to listen to this all the way through, now's a good time to pause. If you are, now's a good time to waddle down to the kitchen and get yourself some refreshments. You'll probably hear me and Will chatting a little bit, so enjoy your break.
I'm going to get a drink. I'm back in 30 seconds. Ta-da! Hello? Are you back?
I tried to connect to a different network and it just wasn't having it, and so it decided to just kill itself, and then I had to ring you back on the new network. Will, I was just, whilst you were away and then before the connection issues, I was just telling the dear listeners how I forgot to crack open my can of Coke in front of the microphone and pour it into a glass this week. I wouldn't say it was the highlight of the podcast, although I'm not sure we have any.
No.
The highlight is probably the end.
Yeah.
So
everyone
funny.
pats themselves on the back because they got through it.
Right, so I've just been editing the break, and there really isn't anything to salvage that is mildly entertaining or worth putting in the podcast. So it's a super short break, and I even had to cut out the bit where we said let's get back to the podcast because we're kind of talking over each other and everything, and it was really unprofessional, and more so than this podcast normally is. So with that said, back to the main body of the podcast. So Will had just asked the question, who is worst affected by this? Hong Kong.
Well, not obviously people of Hong Kong, but I'm talking about outside
Yes.
of Hong Kong.
I want to talk about HSBC though and their involvement because they've been a bit of a dick.
So you think it's HSBC?
Well, no, not as a, but I just want to talk about them anyway. I'll do it after because it's more about the economics. We'll push that to the end. Bit. I guess it is there. This is more. I guess it is the economics bit.
So HSBC, go.
Well, yeah. So they've not really got a great deal to lose, but they've just not been very nice.
Great analysis there. It's an A star for your A level.
HSBC, what's happened is Peter Wong, head of Asian business, has been in Hong Kong, where on Wednesday a picture of him emerged signing a petition to support China's intention to impose a national security law. So basically, the guy who's the head of HSBC in Asia supports the Chinese regime. Now, no doubt he's doing that for economic purposes and for the business and for the profits rather than for his actual belief in the regime, because if you really agree with that, then you're not the world's best person. But the reason it's good for HSBC to support the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party is 85% of the profits for HSBC last year were in Asia, and Hong Kong counted 54% of those profits. And so by basically sucking up to the Chinese Communist Party, you're more likely to be able to get into the Hong Kong and Chinese market to make more money. And so despite being Europe's biggest bank, it's not actually focused in Europe at all. And so the issue with this is not only is it a big corporation backing the Chinese Communist Party, who are, totalitarian dictatorship, who don't care for human rights or civil liberties, it's actually long-term might not be very good for them, because if the sort of economic tide turns against China and people start imposing more sanctions and more pressure and there's less leeway for them, basically, it could cause issues simply because the more they get involved with China, the closer and closer they get tied in, and the less freedom they'll have. And so, by supporting China, this is like the first step into down what could be a slippery slope for the company. And so they'll lose, their ability to use other world countries and powers to get profit. And so, basically, what they're doing is almost cutting themselves off in the pursuit for short-term profits, and it's just not a great idea, and it's also not very ethical. Who do you think is going to be most affected by this, Will?
I think the USA could have a massive implication on this, because let's just put it like this: they do in Hong Kong. They have a $66 billion trade agreement with them, or trade relationship, which is investments, businesses that are in there, so on and so forth. So if they're now part of China, obviously going on increasing with the US trade war, would this mean now they put on tariffs and treat them the same as China? Because now on the 27th of May, Mike Pompeo said Hong Kong is no longer autonomous, and Trump the day before said he wasn't very happy with how China is dealing with the whole Hong Kong situation. So could this be the end of the US special treatment of Hong Kong, and could we see them being treated as a part of China again? Yeah, but I think they're going to miss out on that huge chunk of trade if they now start a trade war again, and it's going to be very interesting to see where that continues on. And obviously you're the economics expert, so you can lecture me on that now.
Well, yeah, I just think with the US, it's again, they've got the $66 billion trade agreement with them, but it's all the stuff that sort of hangs around that and it's dependent on that. So it's not just a direct trade, but it's also all the wealth and the money created by that industry that works with Hong Kong is then later passed down the line, and it's passed through to consumers who then go and spend it. And so whenever you see headline figures, I don't know what US GDP is, but it's in the trillions, and so 66 billion doesn't sound like a great deal, but it's not.
It's still a lot though.
It's a huge it's a huge amount of money. But economics is usually a wide chain of people, and every action affects another. It's almost like the butterfly effect. So while 66 billion directly is a large part of the American economy, I'm pretty sure it must make up even more through indirect. Some more economics I was going to talk about is not actually reflected to who's going to get hit hardest, but more about why China has decided to step on the toes of Hong Kong. In 1993, the Hong Kong economy was worth $120 billion annually, and in China, it was only $445 billion as a whole. So that meant the Hong Kong economy made
Isn't
up
it like
20.
Hong Kong? We've seen like a 900% increase since 1916
Yes.
GDP.
Yeah, Hong Kong's grow rapidly, and so average income, when accounted for inflation, doubled since 1960. So that means people were twice as well off as they were. But yeah, so in 1993, Hong Kong had $120 billion a year. That's what the economy is worth. And in China, the sum total was $445 billion. So that means that Hong Kong made up 27% of the Chinese economy. Now, China has exploded economically, and so they've got loads of mega cities popping up, and their economy is huge. They're investing so much money into infrastructure, and so now they
My
are.
interesting fact on Chinese infrastructure is they build 6,000 miles of motorway every year.
I can do the maths on that actually. Really vague sums. It's about 150 miles to drive from here to where my dad lives. Right, maybe no, it's maybe a bit less than that. Say it's 150 miles from here from Manchester to Bristol to drive. 4 times that would be 600 miles. So they're building Manchester to Bristol on a motorway 40 times every year.
Mad.
Bloody hell. That is mental. Right. As I was saying, 1993, Hong Kong made up 27% of the Chinese economy, but China has since expanded and they've got so much infrastructure and so much wealth coming through that now Hong Kong only accounts for 3%. Now it's still huge for the size of its population, almost 7.5 million people, as opposed to China with 1.4 billion. And so Hong Kong is still incredibly wealthy, and per capita it's one of the richest countries in the world. But so China, it's now worth slightly less than it was at the start of their jurisdiction over the country in 97. And so what that means is they are becoming less and less fearful of trying to bring it into their hold, because if they make Hong Kong a slightly less liberal and less free market and a less free population, whilst it will be 3% of the economy, they take an economic hit. Xi Jinping wants loads of power, and he wants the most power he can get, and he doesn't want part of China to have free media, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press, and all this kind of thing. And so he thinks it's better to take that economic hit and constrain Hong Kong instead. And so I think that also talks a lot about the regime in itself, that they are willing to compromise the living standards of their people just so they have power over a further amount of population. China's already starting to interfere. Every evening, the news broadcast that you get, so like the 6 p.m. news here in Britain, it starts up with an opening scene of a collection of Hong Kong nationals doing traditionally Chinese things, and then the news broadcast itself is in Mandarin, and this is the Hong Kong news rather than the wider Chinese news. So, and the national language of Hong Kong is actually Cantonese. So it's a famous phrase, is one way to quiet a rebellion is to take away their language, and that's basically what they're doing, is they're trying to suppress Cantonese, and they're saying how it's an alternate dialect to Mandarin when actually it is a different language in itself. They're similar, but it's definitely a different language. And so there's that, and then there was I don't know, do you know about what happened with the bookstore, Will?
No, go on.
This is actually really interesting. So what happened was there was a bookstore that was selling books that were critical of the Chinese Communist Party and the leaders, and they published in-depth reports and facts on their even the sexual lives and the private lives of highly influential members of the Chinese government. And so what happened was, over the course of about a year, people who worked at this bookshop began disappearing. The bookshop later closed down. Now, one of these men appeared, who worked at the bookshop, on Chinese national television with tears in his eyes. And the quote is, "I want to return to China and turn myself in. I want to shoulder my own responsibility. I'm also willing to accept any punishment." The words of a man who looked absolutely terrified. And he disappeared, firstly, and then he appeared on Chinese television. And so that's the sort of thing that this government will do, in the sense that even though it's in Hong Kong, they still, and they probably aren't allowed to do that legally, but there's no way it can be proven that they've done it, and it's all going to be covered up. Kind of lengths they're willing to go, literally, to make people disappear and murder people for simply publishing the truth. And which, in this country, you hear all about political scandals. You need to be able to hold your government to account in whatever way possible. You need to know they're honest people, and you need to know that they've got good intentions. It's that kind of suppression. And again, the Chinese in 2014 tried to control who stood in for election in Hong Kong in order to try and get a pro-China candidate. China promised to stay out of the democracy, but there's huge protests and tear gas was used, loads of pepper spray jets, and so these people actually had to buy umbrellas so they could withstand the protests with all the tear gas and pepper spray that was being thrown at them. And so it became known as the umbrella movement, and it was kind of a political awakening. And so some more interesting statistics. Between 1997 and 2008, there was always a fluctuating level of identification between whether people thought they were Chinese or whether they thought they were, more like a Hong Kong national. And at its peak in 2008, 39% of people identified as Chinese and 18% as though they were from Hong Kong. And yet by 2018, there'd been almost an identical flip the other way, where 40% said they believed that they were from Hong Kong and 18% thought they were Chinese nationals. And so it just shows, and since getting to power in 2013, Xi Jinping and his efforts to try and constrain Hong Kong has just turned the population against. And so it just, yes, it shows that Hong Kong does not want this to happen. There's, and it also shows how authoritarian the government is to use pepper spray and tear gas on people protesting for freedom of election. We've seen tear gas used in other protests where it's probably not necessary, and it's not something that we really want to see.
No, not at all. My final question is to you, James. What should we do about this? What should Britain do about it?
Sunday Telegraph columnist Daniel Hannan has proposed, and
we have literally just discussed this in the break.
Yeah, we discussed this in the break, but it's going to get that'll get cut out, and we'll rediscuss it here with slightly better discussion. Daniel Hannan and Liam Halligan, both Telegraph columnists. These are the only two articles that I've read.
Daniel Hannan, Conservative MP.
He's not an MP. He's an MEP.
Oh, MEP. Sorry.
Now he's not got a job. He's one of the main guys in the Brexit vote. Yep. Anyway, right. Yeah. So Daniel Hannan wrote the article, and I've seen it was backed, or it was also referenced in Liam Halligan's economic column, both in Sunday Telegraph. Now, I've not seen this mentioned elsewhere, but I wouldn't be surprised if it cropped up. The idea is basically, because Hong Kong is being strangled by China, Britain has the ability to grant everybody in Hong Kong British national status because it was a former colony. I think everybody born before 1997 has this status already. And so it's like they're British nationals overseas, and so it doesn't mean that they're a bit like the EU. They've not got freedom of movement to come here, but they're it's like a second class of British nationality, right? So they can get British passports. Now, what this means is that you would be able to have people from Hong Kong coming to Britain. And so what Daniel Hannan proposes is, instead of having these people integrate into British society, we could create a new Hong Kong for them in the British Isles in order to let them maintain their culture and their country and their economic freedoms. It's called laissez-faire economy, and that's sort of the name of it, and it means very free market economics, and it's what the population there seems to like. And so that would be the plan, and it's almost like saying here, he said, he proposed the idea you could use somewhere like the Isle of Wight, and they could just build Hong Kong 2.0. I love the idea. It's just logistically a little bit difficult to get your head around. Obviously, Hong Kong is very densely populated, so you wouldn't need a large space. And they're saying how maybe you could use a small area in the northeast simply because it would bring levels of investment there. And they're saying how you could use, Britain could have access to this area as well. It wouldn't be part of Great Britain, but, we'd obviously have a closely tied agreement with them. But Hong Kong would still maintain a high level of independence and freedom. Yeah, I love the idea, but it just seems a bit far-fetched. Will, you had many holes to pick in it, so pick them.
Well, I just think I can see why he wants to do it, but it's just not theoretically possible. Most of where Hong Kong has made its money is in its location. It can do 24-hour trading with all the big financial markets in the world. So it has Japan, has London, has New York. Like, always operate in one of those financial markets at that same time. So if you put it in this country, it wouldn't work. Firstly, because you can't have 24-hour trading, and then also its ports as well. It's vital its ports are in Asia because of like the whole market down there. If you put it here, it wouldn't be as prosperous. Then you have the whole idea of where you're going to put it. Are you going to build a totally new island? Are you going to replace them in some part of the UK? It's too beyond the realms of possibility for it to actually happen. Like, James, where would you put them? You're going to put them in the northeast. Whereabouts?
Well, it could be the northeast. I don't know where I'd put them. It's above my pay grade to decide that because I'm not being paid at all by the British government to make foreign policy decisions. Funnily enough, I'm not sure where I'd put them. I'd put them in an area that can be very quickly industrialised. in an area that's in need of investment, in an area near the ocean, simply for trading purposes. However, it's not geographically close to Asia, which is, again, Hong Kong does obviously, surprise, surprise, a lot of trade with Asia. Now, I think this article isn't proposing that we literally just pick Hong Kong up and dump it in the British Isles. I think it's more of an idea of it would provide part of a solution to a big problem and give the country back its freedom.
Really?
However,
He just says, let's move it here. He even talks about let's build high-rise skyscrapers there.
yeah, that's what you would do. It's a very, very urban population. That's
very
one of the
true.
ways that.
So then, if they have their own autonomy, are they going to have a border around it? Is it going to be a free border just to move in and out of? What's it going to be?
As it is now, or as it was in '97, just before. Well, I don't know. I wasn't going to mention it because it's a bit complicated, but it's a lovely idea.
It's unfathomable.
Will, what's the solution?
I don't know. It's a very complex issue to deal with. You've got to sort of break it down. We said in 1997, if anything goes wrong, we have a responsibility to protect the people of Hong Kong because they are overseas British nationals. We have a power and a duty to them, but then again, you don't want to poke the bear of China.
When you say a bear, it's the biggest bear in the world and the biggest bear the world has ever seen. I don't know, maybe the British Empire was a bear.
What's new story?
I was just going to say a little bit more. I think you are right about not wanting to upset China with it, but I think if there is a huge issue without doing what Daniel Hannan said and just building a new Hong Kong, you just grant them British national status and say, please just come here because this is about human rights. And you've got to remember the points-based system of immigration. The population of Hong Kong is highly educated, very productive, as in levels of productivity there are very high. GDP per capita is very high. These are people who have well-paid jobs who would be really skilled. And so lots of them would pass our skills-based immigration system. And so I think that whilst it probably would upset a few people who don't like them people coming around here, I think, when it comes to this, it's a bigger issue than, immigration numbers at the end of the day. And it's not like we're welcoming in anybody. It's people these were former British citizens.
Yeah.
We can't just let them have all their liberty moved in front of our eyes. And I think it could bring a lot of good to Britain, whether it's culturally or economically. But the perfect solution would be have Hong Kong 2.0, but it's not possible. Well, the perfect solution would be to travel back in time to 1898 and get the absolute moron who wrote the lease deal for 99 years. Oh, yeah, I'll point that out. So the lease deal was written for 99 years. The guy that negotiated it was using 99 years as a metaphor for forever. But legally, it meant he said 99 years is as good as forever. However, he obviously didn't see the rise of the Chinese Communist Party trying to take over Hong Kong, and so it probably wouldn't have been an issue when we handed it back to him. Also, he would have been 50, 60 at the time. 99 years. I mean, it's past his concern and it's past everything. And so the way to solve it, Will, is get Doctor Who, right, get in the TARDIS, go back to 1898 and get them to sign that lease agreement indefinitely. We'll have it forever, please.
Great. So,
and on that note,
worst news story in the Mail on Sunday. They came up with the headline yesterday. What has become of the tolerant Britain we love? And now I'm going to read you some Mail articles from the past couple of years. Migrants, how many more can we take? The swarm on our streets. 4,000 murders and rapists we can't throw out. 1.6 million migrants to settle from the EU. Immigrants bring more crime. The more is underlined. Enemies of the people. And jihadis roam free in the UK. A list of all Mail articles over the past couple of years. And you go, how can you say you're still the tolerant Britain when you're pumping out headlines like that are going to obviously stir people up and enrage them in a sort of way to get this kind of political discourse we have now?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's back to that division politics, isn't it?
The irony in that headline yesterday was just...
I think hypocrisy is probably more than irony, actually.
Yeah, you're one of the architects of this level of division we have now, and yet you then take the moral high ground,
as the Mail always tries to do. So I've got a quick worst article just because I've got a car to pick up this evening.
Yes, and I've got a bike ride to go on.
And Will's got a bike ride to go on. Right, so for context, I don't know if this happens on iPhones, but on my phone, which is a Android, if I go to my home screen and swipe to the left, Google basically throws at me a load of articles it thinks I might be interested in. So most of them are sort of cars, but some of them are political, and some of them are completely unrelated. And so it popped up in my feed, and I thought, that is not something I want to read. And so I'll read you the headline. Tipping point player dubbed Ant and Dec's long-lost twin over uncanny appearance. Now, I clicked on the article out of sheer interest, and he doesn't look like either of them, and he looks like a constipated Michael Sheen. I think you should look at the article, Will. I'll send it to you. And I just thought, it's these kind of gossipy tabloids that...
Oh, it's the Mirror, so it's high quality.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's hardly going to be the Telegraph, was it?
Hey?
He looks like Michael Sheen on the toilet.
How is he? What?
1, I don't care, and 2, he looks nothing like them.
Imagine, do you know, the only thing going through my head is imagine studying journalism for 3 years to write articles like that.
I know. It must be so soul-destroying. It's just a load of rubbish. Right, let's go. Will, give me a statement, and I'll waffle it.
The Guardian is the best paper I have ever read.
Well, it's obvious The Guardian is the best paper I've ever read, simply because it's not owned by big billionaire leaders trying to push their own agenda. Another thing that's so great about The Guardian is all the awards it wins. If you read The Private Eye, it's quite often that the Mail or the Telegraph and the Express, those sort of right-wing papers, they come up for telling false truths and lies. And The Guardian very rarely appears in The Private Eye. There we are. That was better. It's true. The Guardian doesn't actually often appear in the criticism section. Right, Will, your statement is... A bright green Renault Clio 1.2 is better than a 1.3 white Mazda.
Of course it's better than a 1.3 Mazda. I mean, on the Clio, it's got a turbocharger on it. It looks far cooler. The stereo's already been taken out. You're going to do loads of modifications on it. It's so much easier to do. You got it at a far cheaper price, and it's a far quicker car. You can practically double the horsepower of the Clio than you can to the Mazda. Thank you.
I've not got double the horsepower. I've just got 21 more. No, I didn't. I never said I got double the power. I said I've got 21 more. No, I never said I got double the power because you've got 81 and I've got 100. I've not got 160 horsepower.
I'm defending the indefensible.
It's not indefensible. My car is better than yours.
No, it's not.
Well, I know you wouldn't want.
Just ruined my next one. My next one was James Bacon. Now, I wholeheartedly regret buying a bike Clio. 3, 2, 1, go.
The reason I regret buying my car is because there's a few bits and bobs to do on it, and I just couldn't be bothered. So, for example, I need to replace a seal on the door. Is that? And then when I come to replace a stereo, I have to email a guy on eBay to try and get him to send me the right adapter. And if he doesn't send me the right adapter, then I've spent 44 quid on the wrong thing. And so my car is terrible, and there's no reason I should have bought it. There we go.
See, the good thing about the Mazda
true, and I love
is everything works.
Yours costs double mine.
It doesn't cost double yours.
How much did you pay for your car?
2,500.
Oh no, okay. I thought you paid £3,000. Fair enough. But okay, your car costs 900
It's
quid
double in my maths though, James.
Yeah, and to solve all my problems, it won't cost me 900 quid, but I will still have 21 horsepower more than you.
So that the driver, not the car.
What? Right, Will, here's one for you. As of right now, I am going to become vegan, just like James.
Of course I'm going to become vegan. It's far more environmentally friendly, and it's far more tastier. The stuff that you have sent me looks absolutely scrumptious. I can't wait to get my chops around it. Honestly, it's far more environmentally friendly. This is the way we need to go for the world, because we need to save this planet, because this is the only planet we've got left. Vegan all the way, guys. Vegan all the way.
You bring up the point about environmental friendliness. Why don't you give it a go?
Because it's just not as tasty. I don't have a lot of it, like most people. I eat it in moderation. It's not like I'm like, meat all the time.
And what about eggs and dairy?
I don't like eggs.
Good.
Don't drink a lot of milk. I only have it in my tea.
I'll let you off then, Will.
See, thank you.
I'm also, you got to remember, I'm not one of those preachy vegans because they are the worst.
Yeah, they are the worst. No, I'm vegan. Fuck off.
They're just like socialists, but of the dietary world.
Mate, and half of them are socialists. All right, I've got to think of one final one. Footballers deserve a pay raise. 3, 2, 1, go.
We actually think about it. George Clooney in the year of 2018 earned about £40 million, and that was for a few films that provided maybe a total of 10 hours entertainment. But if you think about footballers, they provide hours and hours and hours of entertainment, and some of them only get £10 million a year. So I think if you actually use the maths for Hollywood superstars and how much entertainment they give us
Time's up.
versus footballers, there we are, easy peasy. That was good logic, wasn't it?
I was literally like, right, he's not answered the question yet.
Just wait. I was getting there. Right, Will, your statement, you ready? You won't like this one. Formula One is a better sport than rally.
Formula One is absolutely a better sport than rally. I mean, look, you've got far better drivers. It's the peak of engineering performance. You're spending lots of money for stuff that can actually be used in cars later on down the line. I mean, you've got better drivers, better personalities as well. Look at Lewis Hamilton. Still, he rises. He's the GOAT. He's the greatest driver of all time. I can't wait to see him again. I hated that.
I agreed with you.
That was awful.
Yeah, I thought you'd just struggle on that one.
Let's bring back zero traction control, loud engines.
Yeah, Will, but that's not like with the times, is it? And that's what F1's meant to be. It's meant to be the pinnacle of like human
Boredom.
engineering. No, only the French GP. With that said, Will, we do need to do an outro. Who's doing the outro this week?
You can.
I wonder why. Right, okay.
It's not funny.
It was funny. Right. Thank you for listening to Something Near the Centre. I hope you've enjoyed it this week. Will, have you enjoyed recording this week?
Yeah, I have actually.
Well, I'm sure for you, things are just getting more and more tedious as the time goes on, and you've got less and less to do, and more and more stressed. So I'm glad to interrupt your days. We're going to go cycling at some point, aren't we, Will?
Tuesday.
Oh, okay, so we'll actually have recorded the other podcast by the time we've gone cycling. But still, this is going out tonight, so you'll all know that we're going cycling on Tuesday. So we'll let you know about that in next...
I'll beat him again.
We won't even be able to let you know about that in next week's podcast. We won't have gone by the time we record next week's podcast.
And I'll beat him again.
So in 2 weeks' time, you can find out how our cycling was. Oh, great. Well, that's that. And on that note, thanks for listening. See you again soon.
Goodbye.
It's still raining. I really want to vacuum my car out, and I'm just sad. Well, that's probably
Rally's better.
You've been listening to Something Near the Centre. The podcast was presented by Will Turner and James Baker, and it was edited by me, James Baker. Thank you for listening. See you again next week.